DUDUS. The President. Before DUDUS became the president, he was already a Don, born a Don. And according to many, with him already being gangland royalty, and now ascending to the throne, he did pretty much what all Dons did: handle business, squash the competition, and intimidated those that had a spectator's view. But before we get into all that, there's a bit of information too critical to be ignored. Those who knew DUDUS best, or were closest to him, are almost all quick to say that unlike his father, DUDUS never really trusted Mr. Seaga, and never came around to fully doing so. Live and let live. This information is extremely critical, and in retrospect, also a clear indicator as to why certain precedents were set in place from the inception of DUDUS's takeover, the type of precedents that facilitated major power shuffles that left gangland in awe, the type of shift that according to Tivoli Gardens elders, took control forever out of Mr. Seaga's hands, and placed it firmly into the hands of the president. Shortman, DUDUS, never trust the boss, Mr. Seaga, and everybody did know why. A never no secret, people just left that alone after a while. Translated, Shortman, DUDUS, did not trust the boss, Mr. Seaga, and everybody knew why. It wasn't a secret. People just left it alone after a while, stated on aging Tivoli Gardens thug, who claimed to have been a part of the West Kingston inner workings at one time. The old thug was not alone in his claim, because according to many who are supposed to be in the know, this was basically the stance that DUDUS took when it came to Mr. Seaga. He dealt with him not because he wanted to, but because he had to, and as such, dealt with him from a distance, never once getting close to him, like previous Dons did. Then there are others who say it wasn't that DUDUS didn't trust Mr. Seaga, per se, they say he just didn't trust anyone, period. Plus with all the unanswered questions and all the talk orbiting around the saga involving his father, the like of which went as far as suggesting that Mr. Seaga either knew more than he was willing to admit, about Jim's sudden demise, and or, how he, Mr. Seaga, may have even been directly involved. Needless to say, with all those arguments, fact or fiction making none the difference, this was one last person DUDUS was interested in getting close to, regardless of who he was. DUDUS was a cautious, sometimes even a suspicious skeptic, with the almost tragic justification that he had every reason to be. But for every analogy there is a counter, and some have credited this type of behavior to one simple word: astrology. Born on March 13th, DUDUS ruled under the sign of Pisces, so according to astrology, he was a natural risk-taker, but life had taught him to embrace an entirely different persona, one of immense caution, a characteristic that even saw him becoming a bit of a cynic when it came to his dealing with others, even those closest to him. This is what those who dealt with him frequently saw, and had trouble dealing with: his constant Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde persona. Never quite sure what to expect from him, on a moment-by-moment basis. If not for those casual, occasional instances, DUDUS was not by a long shot the easiest person to deal with. On the other hand, most that had the brief pleasure of meeting him or even encountering him in passing, would have never guessed that he was who he was, even if their life depended on it. He was too polite and articulate, too calm, too smooth, and definitely too quiet. But this was DUDUS, a man who learned from early the power of portraying an image that is counter to your actual reputation and persona. This was who he was, and how things were, and if you were privileged enough to be part of the inner workings, you simply accepted it. You may not have liked it, but if you were there, you were smart enough not to be stupid enough to let your thoughts of displeasure transform into actual vocals. To put it simply, DUDUS was a challenge from the start. No other Don had ever behaved like him. All those before him were seen, they made sure they were, but not DUDUS. Except for his constant games of soccer, it was as though he was in constant hiding. The list of issues that surrounded him didn't stop there, because in spite of who was in charge, and regardless of how tough they may have been known to be, or actually was, in comparison, They were relatively easy to deal with when compared to DUDUS. None was as complex as he was. One of the key elements that kept everyone in line, the fear of uncertainty. Most dons before DUDUS were just happy to be in the position that they had eventually found themselves, with little thought of much else, and they were not shy about letting it known either. But when DUDUS was compared to them, the difference was like that of night compared to day. He never seemed happy. Instead, he always appeared to be skeptical and in deep thought. Other traits that separated DUDUS from all his predecessors was that he was exposed, educated, by leaps and bounds when compared to all his forerunners, and forward-thinking in more ways than one. A point made clear from early in his reign. When after the smoke cleared, he made it even clearer, in more ways than one, that this was not going to be another typical continuous Wild West shoot 'em up chapter in the West Kingston chronology. No. His outlook was different, so much so that it ushered in a welcome change that no one could deny if they were to be truthful, facilitating one of the most peaceful crime-free periods that West Kingston and the entire downtown business district had seen. Quite possibly since Jamaica's independence in 1962. From the inception, DUDUS's focus was different, driven by a different type of determination. He was dedicated to a totally different cause, the likes of which it seemed no other don would have even dared imagining at the time. A calculated risk-taker, and a master at multitasking, the latter being a skill that propelled his elevation in gangland even further. This was DUDUS, and as time progressed, he got better, or worse, all depending from which side one was witnessing. The man, DUDUS, did have a style we him look pon you like him a look through you. Believe me, enough man me see de look debut dung, without even a word. Translation. The man, DUDUS, had a style where he would look at you like he was looking right through you. Believe me, I have seen that look break down many men, without even a word being uttered. Calculating, silent, and intimidating. That was DUDUS, the same person he appeared to be before donship, but who after taking control of the reins of power, simply became a more astute version of what he already was. People who talk too much will eventually, almost always, say the wrong thing, or at least say too much. A lot has been said about Christopher DUDUS Coke, and the blatant hatred that the garrisons of Jamaica harbor, when it comes to so-called informers. The same as snitches, and the above is exactly what DUDUS' outlook was. Why give a speech when the point you're trying to make is in one sentence? He spoke to the point, short and sweet, and always, he spoke only on what was necessary. One individual who claims to have grown up with DUDUS makes the claim that the president never did in a whole heap of talking ting from long time, dat never knew, and him never too in a new body were always a talk, is a man who feel like see, if you have a ting fissy, see it and done, waldy talking far. Translated. The president, DUDUS, was never into a whole lot of talking that was just him, and it never changed, and he wasn't too fond of anyone who was always talking either. He was the type of person who felt like if you had something to say it and be done. What was all the talking for? This was his stance, his persona, one of his major characteristics, a man of few words who prided himself on being a good listener. Many say this again was another tool he used to intimidate and instill fear, always seemingly listening to you so attentively, it was as if he was waiting to catch you in a lie. From all accounts, DUDUS had always been a quiet individual, always seemingly in deep thought, and with his elevation to the top of Tivoli Gardens food chain, such a persona was galvanized even further. Some say he became withdrawn, and very, very suspicious of almost everybody and everything around him, and was almost in a consistent state of paranoia. He saw what others didn't, and what wasn't even there, and heard what others didn't and what wasn't even said, but with him being who he was, it didn't take long for almost everyone under his influence to begin marching to the beat of the same drum. You got so close and no more. Before DUDUS, dons had always been the most colorful characters in their realm of power. the loudest, the most arrogant, and in almost every case, they were amongst the most recognized individuals, at least in their own territories, but not DUDUS. It was as if this new Dom didn't even exist. Those who knew him, but not even they were privy to see him at times. He became somewhat of an enigma, but what many didn't know, was that this, like almost all his other moves, this one also came from his calculated and sinister temperament. Like all Dons before him, DUDUS did however surround himself with a few hand-picked individuals. The only difference was, in comparison to his predecessors, the hand-picked individuals were no longer from the old guard, like they usually were, and to the surprise of many, some weren't even from Tivoli Gardens or West Kingston for that matter. This was unheard of, and a move that was as unorthodox could get, when it came to the type of gangsterism that was known to govern territories, such as Tivoli Gardens at the time. And if that wasn't enough, he was empowering them, literally deputizing them. What was DUDUS doing? That was the private question of many, who dared not voice their discontent until recently. He was breaking all the rules that were a part of the fabric of West Kingston from day one, and to add insult to injury, this was Jim Brown's son. He above everyone else should have known better, so what was he doing? How could he be letting strangers into the fold? Members of the community became concerned, but what they didn't know was that DUDUS saw what they didn't. He wasn't disillusioned, he wasn't blind, he didn't have tunnel vision, and he didn't have unblinkers either, because unknown to them, the same rules and principles that so many were so adamant about upholding, in truth had failed miserably and led to deaths of many before him, including his father and brother. So why should he, DUDUS, adhere to any of those rules, or hold on to any of those so-called failed principles and practices? He was going to make his own rules. DUDUS had seen the end result of many a Don before him. Their mistakes were his to analyze and learn from, and he refused to make the same mistakes they did. Claude was executed with hands in the air shortly after initiating peace. His father had died in what was now seen as a suspicious fire, and his brother was killed because of, if he was to tell it, a lack of security and being too visual, not to mention all the others, so his entire approach to Donship was different. One key example: the introduction of strange faces. What many didn't understand at the time, was that the influx of these new faces to the mix, Tivoli Gardens inner circle, created a smoke screen that was to DUDUS's benefit. With not many knowing him, the introduction of what was obviously influential strange faces, who all seemed to have power of Donship, suddenly made things confusingly interesting, especially with the fact being, no one outside the circle and Tivoli actually knew what the new Don looked like. Such a move also kept everyone else in line without even making an overt attempt to, because these loyal strangers showed that his power source was not limited to just those in the immediate garrison around him. These strange moves kept everyone on edge, kept them talking, guessing, wondering, and while they did, DUDUS thrived. A new dawn. His survival depended on his approach, and he knew that, and after the dust settled, DUDUS was heard of, heard from, but rarely ever seen. Shots were called by him, that was common knowledge, but he was never seen firing one, all a part of his new approach, and in a matter of time, he literally became somewhat of a phantom. So much mystery surrounded DUDUS that he even became the subject of folklore, stories so fantastic, if one didn't know better, one may believe that they were talking about some noble saint or a celestial being. Call it a move of necessity, but there's a reasonable and oftentimes pretty simple explanation for actions of this nature, and when it comes to DUDUS being not only elusive, but almost invisible, the explanation is relatively simple. DUDUS was cautiously scared. No, DUDUS wasn't a coward, but at the same time, he wasn't stupid either. He was cautiously scared, and had every right to be. To understand this, first you have to at least make the attempt to grasp his mindset, and then at least try to understand where he would have been mentally, in, around and after February 1992. DUDUS In, around and after February 1992, petrified, adjective. Terrified, horrified, shocked, frozen, stunned, appalled, numb, dazed, speechless, aghast, dumbfounded, stupefied, scared stiff, scared shitless, taboo slang, terror-stricken. Petrified is without doubt where DUDUS was mentally, before, around and definitely by February 1992. Recently out of his teens, DUDUS was merely 22 years old, and as much of a don as he was by birth, and notwithstanding how much training he had, by no means was he anywhere near ready for the shoes that he was about to fill. There was no doubt that he wanted the position, that goes without saying, confirmed by the adamant face-off between him and Liberty regarding the leadership of Tivoli Gardens and its enclaves, but even with all that, DUDUS still wasn't ready. The reality of the situation was, his, DUDUS, father was dead, his brother was dead, and so was his sister, all in one tragic, bloody and rapid succession. A reality that without doubt came with major mental pressure, anguish and uncertainty, the likes of which eventually led to the inevitable relocation to a constant petrified mental state. With so many related deaths in the air, DUDUS was no doubt concerned about his own mortality, and to keep his vulnerability subdued or hidden, which he literally had to. He couldn't let anyone see him sweat. He became what he eventually became. An extremely suspicious and calculating individual. DUDUS' transition to top man was no easy task, and came with way more challenges than most may have realized, and way more than he was letting on. He may have been Jim Brown's son, but not everyone was on his side, and that was clear from the get-go. Hence the bloodshed that commenced immediately over control after Jim Brown and JRT's demise. So with that being the issue it was, how could DUDUS not be concerned? It was only natural. Then to make matters even more complicated, there was the already concentrated and fruitful drive to dismantle what once seemed like the impregnable shower posse. The issues were many. Vivian Blake, almost like an uncle to DUDUS, and the head and brain of the operation, was under federal indictment for the last 4 years. At the time, since 1988 to be exact. And he, Vivian, was also on the run, so even if he wanted to turn to his father's proven friend for any type of help whatsoever, there was an issue. Then there was also the unthinkable, snitching in the ranks of the very posse that was known to have zero tolerance for informers. Things were unraveling fast. Along with Blake, the federal indictment had 34 other names on it, and it was getting worse by the minute. Several posse members, including Shower Howie, Banana, Foodhead, Sugar Belly, and Snowman, all notorious Shower Posse members, were already either arrested, brought up on charges, doing lengthy prison sentences, dead or on the run, while still others were already deported or had made their way back to Jamaica in a bid to avoid prosecution. The organization was unraveling, crumbling, and the normality at which things once operated, alongside the normality that he, DUDUS himself once knew, was suddenly becoming no more. And couple all this with everything else that was happening on the ground, around him, up close and personal, and the reality becomes apparent, enough to put anyone in a mental state that DUDUS eventually had little choice of residing in, the state of being consistently petrified. Paranoid, adjective. 1. Psychiatry, of, characterized by, or resembling paranoia. 2. Psychiatry, informal, exhibiting undue suspicion, fear of persecution, etc. This was yet another key characteristic that marked DUDUS's arrival at the coveted position of power. He suspected everyone and everything, near and far. But then again, whom could he trust? Definitely not the members of the old guard. He had seen how things were handled in his father's absence, and he had heard all the talk and whispers, so his trust level for them was next to zero. Then there was the if he could do it factor. A factor that came to life with Charles Little Nuts/Modler Miller, the once high-profile posse member who turned on them, not only spilling the beans, but more like the entire pot, along with recipes as a bonus to federal authorities in a bid to save his own skin. This was one of those cold hard facts that would have been hard to deal with for anyone, let alone DUDUS, a person born and reared on the teachings of Garrison Gospel, where one of the ecclesiastical laws were, no informing. This was one of his father's key associates, one who he had no doubt seen countless times, and known from he was a mere youth, from the days of Modler's Tivoli Gardens residence, late 70s to the early 80s. This was an individual who was considered family. Keep in mind that Modler was not from Tivoli Gardens to begin with, he wasn't even Jamaican. He was from the twin island of St. Kitts and Nevis. However, he was looked at as somewhat of an honorary resident, given somewhat of a green card by the Dons themselves, Jim Brown and Vivian Blake. But despite all that, Charles Little Nut, Modler Miller, was one of the first to roll over and sing like a canary. So with all this in mind, the issue of trust was almost non-existent when it came to the reality of Christopher DUDUS Coke, in, around, and after February 1992. The issues were many, but DUDUS was no fool. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He had to trust someone. Life and his survival required that. His solution was a tight and influential circle, so close-knitted that some have even suggested that to this very day, it still bears signs of impenetrability. Skeptic. Noun. 1. A person who questions the validity or authenticity of something purporting to be factual. 2. A person who maintains a doubting attitude, as towards values, plans, statements, or the character of others. 3. Any later thinker who doubts or questions the possibility of real knowledge of any kind. This was DUDUS, a skeptic of the highest order, but he was a skeptic with reason. He wasn't delusional, he wasn't imagining things. What he feared and was concerned about was real. His life could be snuffed out at any given moment. His issues of trust were also real. He believed his father was betrayed by those closest to him, and those who were once trustworthy had proven that there was indeed no honor amongst thieves. And with this, DUDUS questioned everything and second-guessed everyone. He literally wanted nothing to do with the old guard. A new Don was on the throne, with young guns in tow, and with their view of the old guards being mere elders whose time had passed, and were due elders' respect, but nothing more. DUDUS was sure of at least one thing: the young guns were actually on his side. Call it a battle of the old versus the young, but many say, even without DUDUS's instructions, the young guns weren't too inclined to side with or follow any member of the old guards anyway. They wanted their share of the pie, and viewed them as obstacles. The lines were drawn, and with them, the young guns, siding with the new Don. Elimination of those he wanted eliminated, even if it wasn't said out loud or directly, came with quickness. The young guns may not have known the depths of what they were getting into, but they lined up behind DUDUS, and were quick to prove their allegiance to the Don, with trigger action. DUDUS' skepticism and paranoia were known to be deadly, and with no one wanting to fall under his suspicion, there was a continuous rush to show just how loyal one truly was, which sadly, many a times, came in the form of extensive, senseless and grotesque acts of violence and bloodletting. One senior resident, originally from Tivoli Gardens community, displaced due to what she claims was the accusation of a top man, regarding the questionable acts of a member of her family, who desires to remain nameless, made this claim about the early days of DUDUS' reign: "You hear me, mean you have nothing bad fissy bout de Don still in up, but mean you too have nothing good fissy bout him friend them, cause dem evil. A dem same time day, 92. 93, the youths dem start draw card and kill off nuffady big man in a de place, cause dem no see short man never trust de man dem, so anything dem see de man dem see or do, whether dem did tweet it or not, dem no see him woulda believe." Translated: Listen, I have nothing bad to say about the Don, but when it comes to his friends, there is not much good to say, or that can be said about them, because they are evil. It was around that time that some of them started to cast accusations in a bid to justify their killings of those who were there before them. They knew that Shortman, DUDUS, didn't trust them, the old heads, So whatever was said about them that was suspicious, be it true or not, they knew he, DUDUS, would believe, hence justifying their behavior. Petrified, paranoid and skeptic. These are the three main characteristics that laid the foundation for what was to come. The inauguration of the president.